And so Mike Johnson is clearly still successfully protecting President Trump's abuse of power. And as for his fellow Barnacles in the Senate, how did they justify their votes to forfeit their taxation power to our Orange King? Well, most of them didn't bother to defend the tariffs or their own votes. The shamelessness of most of the Republicans, their dereliction of duty in fealty to Donald Trump, it's just so pathetic. But I am holding on to the fact that Majority Leader Thune allowed these votes. He didn't use any dirty tricks to stop him. And the resolutions passed. And so there is some good news here. The Barnacles are starting to get slippery.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 326th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney, and I'm actually very happy with this episode merely because 326 is my favorite number. I was born on March 26th. I attached 326 to everything. My AOL screen name was Jen326. And so to hit this number, finally, I'm kind of getting a kick out of it. But that is not what this episode is about today. Today, I'm going to give you a summary of what happened in Congress in October 2025. And we're really only going to be talking about half of Congress because the House of Representatives didn't work at all due to Speaker Mike Johnson playing legislative chicken over the shutdown. And so we're going to be looking exclusively at the actions of the Senate. And what the Senate generally did is that they confirmed a lot of people nominated to important positions in government by Donald Trump and confirmed them in an almost unprecedented and I think shameful manner. But we also saw some cracks forming in the protective wall that the Republicans in Congress have built and maintained around President Trump in the month of October. And there were some votes that were notable failures with life and death consequences. But before we get into all of that, I do want to let you know that our community here at Congressional Dish is hurting right now. We've had a pretty severe wave of cancellations on both Patreon and PayPal. So these are the payments that we count on for regular funding. It's really important to us. And with the exception of one of those cancellations, all of them have been due to financial hardships. Specifically, we're seeing a lot of layoffs in our community, and we have medical debts that are crushing our friends here. And if you are one of them, I am so sorry that this is happening to you. I do also have to say that we've noticed a severe drop in the number of Venmos and Zells and paper checks. And so my income is going down too. But as far as I'm concerned, that's okay. I get that you are hurting, and I know how expensive everything is. And I've seen the health insurance increase letters, and I know people are losing their jobs at record numbers, even if the Trump administration refuses to announce the official statistics. And I know that an honor system podcast should be the last thing that you pay for. And this is why I fund this show this way. You need the information, and I get that you can't always pay. And I'm happy that you're listening, especially while Congress is behaving so badly, and our journalists are doing a piss poor job of explaining what's happening. The coverage of the shutdown was absolutely dreadful. And so I feel very blessed to be able to share information via this podcast. And that would be a useless endeavor without your ears. And so sincerely, thank you for listening. But if you are hearing this and you are not financially hurting, now would be a really great time to send in some payments to this show, because this is one of those times when we really need them. And of course, we accept all kinds of different payments. You can pay with PayPal, Zelle, Venmo, Cash App. You can buy the Bitcoin dip. But also, if you want more regular updates on what Congress is doing, you should probably choose to pay per episode on Patreon, or at least per public episode on Patreon, which gets you access to episodes that are right now bonus episodes called Last Week in Congress, which, as you might imagine, are about the last week in Congress. And I do imagine those episodes will get more interesting now that the House of Representatives exists again. But thank you for listening, and I genuinely hope that all of us start to feel more financially secure very soon. Okay, so let's get into all of the October. Now, obviously, the biggest congressional story in October was the shutdown, which encompassed the entire month. Now, I can tell you that the shutdown ended on November 12th. The bill that reopened the government was full of dingleberries, and I will read that 394-page law and make sure I fully understand the changes made, and I will get an episode out to you as soon as I can. But in the meantime, since this episode is a recap of October, in October, the House of Representatives didn't work the entire month. What they chose to do was pass a government funding bill on September 19th, and then they just never returned. But the Senate did work, and they took multiple votes on two bills that could have ended the shutdown. Now, one of the bills was the bill that the House Republicans passed before they decided to go on vacation indefinitely to play legislative chicken. That bill is what we wonks call a clean CR, which stands for a clean continuing resolution, which means it's a bill that simply extends government funding without any partisan dingleberries attached to the bill. The House Republican bill would have funded the government until November 21st, theoretically giving Congress more time that it would need to properly fund all 12 sections of government, since they finished exactly 0 of those funding laws on time this year. But this is the type of funding bill that Democrats have begged Republicans to support during past funding crisis situations. There was nothing wrong with that bill. And so the House Republicans passed it and then refused to work again, essentially telling the Senate, you can pass this or the government will remain closed. And so the Senate voted on that clean continuing resolution 14 times. And every vote result was essentially the same. All Republicans except for Rand Paul of Kentucky voted yes every time. All Democrats and independents except Angus King of Maine, John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, and Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada voted yes every time. The vote tally was consistently over 50 yes votes, but because of a filibuster put on the bill, it needed 60 votes to move forward, and so despite the votes getting a majority of senators, it failed to move forward every time. The Senate also voted 7 times on the bill that the Democrats wanted. Now, if you were learning about this from pretty much anyone on the television or from Democratic Party lawmakers themselves, you would think that the Democrats' bill was a relatively clean CR with an extension of COVID-era subsidies that would help people who don't get health insurance via a corporation to afford to pay for their own insurance. These helpful payments would be the Affordable Care Act subsidies, or ACA subsidies. But if you were to think that, that would be wrong. The Democrats didn't even propose a bill like that, a clean CR plus only ACA subsidies, until November 7th. Instead, for the vast majority of the time, the Democrats were trying to get a bill passed that would have funded the government only through October, would have extended those ACA subsidies, would have repealed all of the Medicaid provisions from the Big Beautiful Bill, would have refunded the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and would have, in multiple ways, handcuffed the Office of Management and Budget, which is currently headed by an anti-government zealot named Russell Vought. There were multiple provisions that would have limited his power and set up an investigative unit in government specifically to keep an eye on him. Now, support those measures or don't. I personally do. But the point here is that the Democrats were demanding far more than they were telling the American people. They were demanding things that would have overturned significant provisions of law that the Republicans consider accomplishments, and they added things like the handcuffing of Russell Vought that were certain to draw a veto from President Trump. And their bill was voted on 7 times in the Senate, and it failed every time to even get 50 votes because Democrats and independents do not have a majority in the Senate. And so the government stayed shut down for 43 days, the longest shutdown in U.S. history. And like I said, the shutdown ended in mid-November, and I will give you all the details of the law that reopened the government soon. But in October, when it comes to the shutdown, that's what happened. A lot of failed votes on 2 bills, neither of which, in their original form, ever became law. What the Senate did accomplish was far more staffing for the Trump administration. Because for the second time, the Senate Republicans broke precedent to confirm a large batch of people, this time more than double the number of people that they confirmed the first time they used this trick. Because as I told you in the last month in Congress episode about September 2025, the Senate Republicans, by inventing new rules that allow them to mass confirm people, they confirmed 48 people at once. In October, they confirmed more than double that many people at once, well over 100 people confirmed to positions of great power with only one vote. And I'm going to tell you more about that mass vote in a minute. But first, there were some people whose positions were simply too senior to be included in that block. There were some people who got proper one-by-one votes. And so here are the people who raised my eyebrows. First up, we have our new Undersecretary of the Navy named Hung Cao. He served 25 years in the military, and he served multiple tours in the W. Bush Wars. And so he certainly has the military experience required to be a military leader. But for a while, he also wanted to be a political leader. He ran for office twice. Once he tried to represent Virginia's 10th Congressional District, and he lost. And then he tried to run for Senate against Tim Kaine, and he lost. And so since he was unemployed, Trump tapped him to be Undersecretary of the Navy. And the problems with this dude boil down to he seems to be a macho man and possibly a psycho. So for example, he said that the military only needs, quote, alpha males and alpha females who are going to rip out their own guts, eat them, and ask for seconds, unquote. He also used the phrase warrior ethos in his confirmation hearing, which is one of macho man turned Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's favorite phrases. And Hung Cao talked about delivering, quote, the most lethal Navy and Marine Corps the world has ever seen, unquote. And so he perfectly fits with the pivot that Pete Hegseth wants to make from our war machine being used for defense to instead being big, scary, violent, and offensive. And Hung Cao also fits in with the Trump crowd in that he spreads total bullshit. So for example, Cao said that 15,000 convicted murderers and 16,000 convicted rapists have entered the U.S. southern border and they threaten our democracy, which is a statement that is simply untrue. And I think worst of all, Hung Cao advocated for January 6th rioters who injured approximately 140 law enforcement officers to be released from prison and compensated for being punished. In other words, our new Undersecretary of the Navy sympathizes with participants in a coup attempt orchestrated by the current president of the United States. And so if the military were called upon to help Donald Trump with his next coup attempt, I genuinely don't know whose side Hung Cao would be on, the Constitution's or Donald Trump's. His advocacy on behalf of the dum-dum bumpkins who raided the Capitol building makes me very concerned that the answer could very well be Trump. But this did not bother most of the Republicans. He was confirmed with the yes vote of every Republican except for Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. We also have a new U.S. Circuit Judge for the Third Circuit. This is the Delaware Circuit. Her name is Jennifer Mascott, and we are actually aware of this woman here on Congressional Dish because she was featured on episode 309 of Congressional Dish. She was one of the lawyers who testified in the hearing about the presidential immunity ruling by the Supreme Court. And what I said about her in that episode when introducing her testimony was that it was worth noting that in the first Trump administration, she was working in then President Trump's Office of Legal Counsel through January 2021, when the plot to keep Trump as the president was unfolding around her. Now, I didn't then, and I still don't now, know if she played any role in that coup attempt. She certainly wasn't a central figure in the plot, but she was around it, and she didn't resign. And because of that, I said that out of all the witnesses, she was the one I trusted the least. But then after Trump left office, she remained an advisor to Donald Trump. And this was after the entire world found out about the details of his attempts to remain president in 2020. And so she can't claim she didn't know what he tried to do when she continued to help him after he left office. And so now President Trump and his Republican partners in the Senate have given her a position as a judge, as a U.S. Circuit Judge for the Third Circuit, which covers Delaware, even though she has never been a licensed lawyer or a judge in Delaware. But we do know she has an expansive view of presidential power. But there was only one Republican once again in the Senate who was bothered by any of this, and that was Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. She was the only Republican to vote no. And then the last person I want to tell you about who was confirmed the proper way was William Mercer, who was confirmed to a lifetime position as a district judge for Montana. William Mercer worked as the acting associate U.S. Attorney General during the second half of the George W. Bush administration, but he resigned in the wake of the scandal related to U.S. attorneys who were fired, and the scandal was that they were suspected to be fired for political reasons. That was a huge scandal back then. I remember it well. And now people are being fired for political reasons all over our government, and it barely even ranks on the list of Trump administration scandals. We are living in such insane times. But anyway, William Mercer, as a lawyer after his resignation, has advocated for religious schools to be given tax money despite the Constitution's clear intention that there be a separation between church and state. As a lawyer for the mining, oil, and gas industries, he has fought against clean air standards. He fought for mining permits despite clean water concerns. And he defended a mining CEO who broke Montana laws that required land to be cleaned up after the mining stops. As a state representative in Montana, he wrote a bill that would require local law enforcement to help ICE agents. As a state representative, he voted for a bill that would limit access to abortion and birth control, and there were no exceptions for survivors of rape and incest. And his voting record also indicates that he's an anti-trans bigot because he voted for bills that would ban trans people from bathrooms, prevent them from playing sports, criminalize doctors who help people with their transitions, and would require schools to dead name and misgender trans kids, which is just cruel. But unfortunately, his positions perfectly match the Republican agenda that they promised at their convention, and that they are acting on now. And so Republicans confirmed this bigot, and he'll be a judge if he wants to be until the day he dies. And so those were the most concerning confirmations who got proper votes. But the en masse confirmations, oh boy. Because when they did this the first time, as you heard in the last month's episode about September, I looked into the 48 people who were confirmed all at once, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that very few of them were monsters. And maybe that's because the first batch had a bright spotlight on them due to the fact that it was the first time the mass confirmation process was being used. But in the shadow of the shutdown, with the en masse confirmation strategy now old news, the second batch, which was far larger at over 100 confirmations at once, it had so many problematic people that both Claire and I were shocked. Claire is my assistant. She helped me with the research on this. But there are simply too many problematic people confirmed. Like, I can't tell you about all of them individually because this episode would be 5 hours long. But in general, there were people who were confirmed to positions of power who want to dismantle the agencies they were confirmed to lead. There are people in health positions who are vehemently and unreasonably strictly against abortion at all stages. We have people now in diplomatic positions in an America First administration who have promised to work on behalf of Israel. We have people put in civil rights and equality ensuring positions who have a history of bigotry and being anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have people who have served as executives in industry who are now policing the industries that made them rich. There's a lot of Trump donors and personal friends of his who got ambassador gigs. And there are people who are simply completely unqualified for the leadership positions that they now hold. As I told Claire in our work chat, I put people on the cut list who would have been national scandals if nominated by any other administration. Forget about them being confirmed. And she told me that she had people on her cut list, people I didn't even see, because their corruption, while present, were just run-of-the-mill bad. So basically, as we work together to research these over 100 people that are now in our government, we were both overwhelmed by the volume of bad. But here are the people who were confirmed by Republicans in a mass vote with the reddest of flags. So first up, we have Todd Wilcox. He is now our Undersecretary of State for Diplomatic Security, and he is yet another violent psycho who was confirmed to the Trump administration. Todd Wilcox, as our new Undersecretary of State for Diplomatic Security, is in charge of security for our diplomats, and he is someone who has cashed in big time on the privatization of our military services. He's a former CIA and Army Special Operations officer who founded two companies. One is Patriot Defense Group, which provides training to the military and intelligence services. He also founded Innovative Logistics, a firm that provides transportation, food, mail, fuel, and other logistics services, which used to be done in-house in war zones such as Afghanistan and Libya. And so now he's going to be in a position to hire on our behalf with our tax money, companies just like the ones he founded to perform these government services for a profit. And the reason I call him a psycho and question his judgment in regards to being a decent human being is that when he tried to replace Marco Rubio as Florida senator in 2016, he criticized the Obama administration for banning waterboarding and other so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, saying they are effective and not torture, even though they have been proven to be ineffective because people say whatever they think the torturers want to hear in order to get it to stop. And these methods are definitely torture. And so I don't want anyone who is pro-torture in charge of any kind of security, but the Republicans snuck this guy into the administration in the shutdown's shadow. We also now have Jacob Hellberg. He is our Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. And this guy is an AI industry insider and is likely to be serving the interests of billionaires with the power of our State Department. I say this because he was a senior advisor to the CEO of Palantir, and he co-founded an anti-China working group which helped write the so-called TikTok ban law. Now, as long-term listeners to Congressional Dish are aware, that law did not ban TikTok. And actually, I guess TikTok users are also aware of that since President Trump is straight up breaking that law every day now by refusing to enforce it. But no one is doing a single thing about it, so enjoy your TikToks. But that law, in addition to the TikTok-specific provisions, gives the president the power to punish hosting companies and app stores if they allow us access to apps, games, and websites that are partially foreign-owned and that are put on what is essentially a baddies list by the president of the United States. That's a rough and dumb summary, but I produced a whole episode about this if you want the details. But basically, the TikTok law is a censorship law designed to keep information sources owned partially by foreigners away from American ears and eyeballs. It's a tool in the propaganda shed. And Jacob Hellberg's group helped write that. And his group was funded by Peter Thiel, the billionaire PayPal guy who also funds the career of Vice President J.D. Vance. When you think of U.S. oligarchy, you should immediately think of Peter Thiel if you're in the know. And so this group of AI-focused oligarchs, which is like mentors and funds the vice president level influential with this batch of Republicans, this group of AI-focused oligarchs are shaping the Trump administration's AI policy, which, surprise, surprise, is focused on limiting regulation and adding data computing resources for AI companies. And Jacob Hellberg is so inside the AI oligarch circle that his wedding was officiated by OpenAI founder Sam Altman. And so I think it's safe to assume that he will be using our State Department to help AI companies be favored on the international market. I also think it's worth mentioning, because he's in our diplomacy department, that Jacob Hellberg used to be a Joe Biden supporter. But he left the Democratic Party and gave $1 million to Donald Trump because of Israel. Because the Biden administration's billions in weapons transfers and total lack of accountability for the indiscriminate carpet bombing of innocent people in Gaza was not enough for Jacob Hellberg. He left the Democratic Party and gave $1 million to Donald Trump because he was afraid that Kamala Harris would cut off arms transfers to Israel, despite no promise or really any signs whatsoever that she planned to do so. He's that biased towards Israel. And now he's in a leadership position in our State Department. And since we just discussed Peter Thiel, one of the guys who co-founded PayPal with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk was Ken Howery, who is now our ambassador to Denmark. Now, usually, I don't give too many damns about ambassador positions, which in this administration are full of Trump's golfing buddies. There's a former NFL player. There's a chick who used to fuck one of Trump's sons. Like, there's a real cast of characters serving as our ambassadors. But a big-time business partner of Peter Thiel as the ambassador to Denmark in this moment is notable because the Trump administration is considering taking control of Greenland. We did an episode about this too. And Greenland is currently governed by Denmark. And so whatever happens in relation to Greenland, a country that has some of the most coveted rare earth minerals in the world, well, the hostile takeover of Greenland would be negotiated on our behalf by Ken Howery, an oligarch and someone closely connected to Vice President J.D. Vance's AI profiteer oligarch master. Next up, we now have Ben Black as the CEO of the International Development Finance Corporation, which I'm going to refer to as the DFC. And I'll be honest, I had never heard of the International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, before this, and there's probably good reason for that. It's because it didn't exist before the first Trump administration. But as the Trump administration is hell-bent on cutting off most of our foreign aid through agencies established a long time ago, like USAID, this sub-agency that the first Trump administration created has survived his chainsaw, and it now has a $50 billion portfolio. Now, what it does with that money is that it offers money and loan guarantees to other countries to finance projects. And as the CEO, Ben Black will be able to direct which projects get the funds. Now, right now, the DFC is one of the ways that we are funneling money to companies making money rebuilding Ukraine, even though the war isn't over. And President Trump has ordered that the money be used to boost U.S. mineral production. Now, we've been following the Ukraine story since 2014, and we know that the riches that make Ukraine such a coveted target for the free marketeers and for Russia are the agricultural, fossil fuel, and mineral riches in Ukraine's soil. And so I suspect that this money is going to be used to extract minerals from Ukraine, which will be sold by Trump-favored multinational corporations for profit. And Ben Black's background strongly suggests that private sector investor profit is his specialty. He was literally born into the game. His dad is billionaire Leon Black, who was chairman of the board at Apollo Global Management, which is one of the largest financial firms in the world. His dad had to leave that position a few years ago after the world found out that he was a business partner of Jeffrey Epstein. Isn't it funny how often that name pops up when talking about people connected to Donald Trump? But anyway, Ben Black, the 40-year-old son of Epstein's billionaire buddy, who is now in charge of the DFC, well, this 40-year-old is a bigwig investor in his own right. With reported assets of well over $200 million, Ben Black founded an investment firm, which he's stepped down from controlling, but he is somehow not being required to divest from, which means he will still be making money from the bets that his investment firm makes. The potential conflicts of interest are obvious, as is the empowering of the oligarch class in yet another government appointment. And so now let's move over into the Justice Department, where we now have Stanley Woodward as our Associate Attorney General, which means he is now the number 3 person in the Department of Justice. And with this shady group vote, Republicans have confirmed another Trump world lawyer to the Justice Department. Because Stanley Woodward, as a lawyer, has been paid to defend Trump's personal aid in the classified documents case. He defended Peter Navarro, who was convicted of contempt of Congress for refusing to testify to the January 6th committee's investigators. And he defended a bunch of the idiots who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Basically, his career lately has been largely dedicated to helping criminals who helped Trump escape accountability. And now he's number 3 at the Justice Department. Moving over into the Labor Department, we now have David Keeling, who's been confirmed to be our Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health, which means he's the head of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, which means that protecting workers as the head of OSHA is now an executive from both UPS and Amazon. In his position as head of OSHA, he's going to be required to police the companies he recently worked for. And here's a sign of how that's probably going to go. Because OSHA has been considering the first federal rule requiring companies to prevent their drivers from getting heat-related illnesses. Basically, the companies might have to provide air conditioning in their delivery vans. Oh, what a burden. And despite that being the most reasonable request imaginable, lobbyists for both UPS and Amazon have fought against the federal heat rules for years. When asked about this in a hearing, our new head of OSHA, former UPS and Amazon executive David Keeling, refused to commit to finishing the heat rule. He said he prefers to let industry continue to police themselves by letting companies set the standards. So even though this position is supposed to be filled by someone on Team Worker, this dude seems like a fox in the henhouse to me. And along the same lines, we now have Andrew Rogers serving as the Wage and Hour Administrator at the Department of Labor. And essentially, he's our boss's lawyer who is now empowered to police our boss. And why do I say that? Well, this guy worked for Littler Mendelson PC, which describes itself as, quote, the union-busting law firm, unquote. The company has represented Starbucks and Amazon and Nissan in their anti-union efforts. And so this guy enforcing wage-related laws doesn't look good for the workers, at least in my crystal ball. Moving over into the environment section, We now have Michael Boren, who's going to be serving as our Undersecretary of Agriculture for Natural Resources and Environment. Michael Boren is a billionaire from Idaho who made his money in investing and accounting. He uses his money regularly to help Republicans gain power. And so fittingly, this money guy has been confirmed to a position that makes him responsible for the U.S. Forest Service, a 30,000-person agency in charge of safeguarding wildlife habitat, drinking water, and the ecological integrity of our country's forests and rangelands. And perhaps the reason he wanted the job, despite him being completely unqualified for it, is because he has a history of fighting with the Forest Service. One of the fights was caused when Michael Bourne, who clearly thinks he can do whatever the fuck he wants, built a cabin without a permit in the Sawtooth National Forest. He chose that land because it was next to land occupied by a mining company that he managed up until February of this year. His wife now manages the mining company. But his fights with the Forest Service, caused by the Forest Service daring to make him and his company follow the laws, got so crazy that he is accused of harassing Forest Service employees with a helicopter. And now he's their boss. We also now have Audrey Robertson, who's going to be serving as our Assistant Secretary of Energy for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And what that means is that Republicans confirmed an oil company executive to be our Assistant Secretary of Energy for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And oil executive is in charge of renewable energy. This sounds made up. I wish it were. Because Audrey Robertson's entire career is a bet on fossil fuels. She started her career by spending 13 years at Kayne Anderson Capital Advisors, a private equity firm that bet 88% of its portfolio on fossil fuels. She then went on to be on the board of directors for Extraction Oil and Gas, Bonanza Creek Energy, New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and Liberty Oilfield Services. She also co-founded a company that was battling the EPA because her company was repeatedly caught poisoning the environment. Since she started the company in 2018, her company had 39 spill incidents, which resulted in 49 reports of different chemicals being spilled. It was also being cited by the EPA for unauthorized emissions, which is a violation of the Clean Air Act. Nowhere in her resume will you find a single given about energy efficiency or renewable energy. And yet, that is what she is in charge of now at the Department of Energy. And this next one, Neil Jacobs, he's our new National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration administrator. This one isn't that big of a deal, but I just found this one funny. Because our new NOAA administration, who I will say believes climate change is really happening, and so he did get some Democratic Party votes in the committee. So it's like, this is not an extremist. He's a decent pick for this, thank God. But remember during President Trump's first term, when President Trump tried to inform the public about what he thought Hurricane Dorian was going to do by editing a NOAA graphic with a Sharpie? Remember Sharpiegate? And that was a forecast that President Trump was, of course, dead wrong about because he's not a weather forecaster. Well, when that happened, actual National Weather Service forecasters dared to correct President Trump, and our new NOAA administration had released a statement at the time criticizing the forecasters instead of President Sharpie. And so President Trump has now promoted him to the head of the agency. Next up, we also now have a new director of Office of Surface Mining. His name is Lanny Erdos, and not surprising at all, he is a coal company executive who is spinning round and round and round the revolving door. Because he had this same position, which is like the top cop in the coal mining police, during the first Trump administration. And in that position, he used his power to weaken federal policing of mine reclamation projects. This is a problem because one of the Office of Surface Mining's main responsibilities is to regulate active mines and make sure that they minimize environmental damage and restore the land after they're done. And he weakened his own agency's power to do that. He also made it harder for local communities to report violations by the coal companies. And so when President Trump was booted out of office, Lanny Erdos then cashed in on his regulatory favors to the coal industry by becoming a top executive at a couple of coal companies. He was the president of one of them. And now, thanks to the Republicans, he's revolving back into government to police the industry that paid him during the Trump off season. Round and round he goes, and because no one covers Congress, nobody knows. And I could keep going. You know I could keep going. But I'm going to stop here with the confirmations because, like I said, I could keep going for literal hours. But you get the idea. Over 100 people with resumes like that confirmed all at once with only Republican votes. That's what the Senate accomplished in October. But now, let's move on to a rare example of the Republicans, or at least some of the Republicans, not being the absolute worst. Because this Congress, entirely controlled by Republicans, has been exceptional only in their willingness to refuse to do their jobs, largely in regards to their refusal to do oversight over the executive branch. And the reason for this is obvious. The Republican Party has shown more loyalty to party than to the Constitution, and so far has protected the president from oversight and any accountability, regardless of what he has done. But that started to change in October. Baby step, but the step was taken. Because the Senate took 3 votes to stop President Trump's abuse of emergency powers, which he is using to enact tariffs around the world. Now, this is notable for a few reasons. One, it's notable because these votes were allowed at all by Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune. But 2, they are notable because the resolutions passed. And so let's take a closer look at these resolutions and the debates around them. So, as I hope we're all aware by now, tariffs are taxes charged on products brought into the United States from other countries. They are paid by companies, and the cost is often passed on to U.S. customers. But the important part to focus on in this debate is the fact that tariffs are taxes. And so here's Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky explaining the problem with the way that President Trump's tariffs are being enacted.
Revenue is not only a question for Congress, but the Constitution commands that taxation legislation originate in the House of Representatives. This is the only issue that specifically has to originate not only in Congress, but in one specific house. Our founders thought that the House of Representatives, elected every 2 years, were closer to the people. And the things they feared the most were big taxes and big government. They said taxes must originate in the House. And yet these taxes are originating with the White House. The idea that one person can raise taxes is contrary to our founding principles. The Constitution forbids it.
And so because the Constitution is pretty clear, President Trump is using emergency powers to enact the tariffs. Here's Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, the author of at least one of the resolutions, with the backstory on the emergency powers President Trump is using to enact tariffs on products coming from countries literally around the world.
What he cites is a statute called IEEPA, dealing with international economic emergencies, and that is a statute that passed by Congress, signed into law decades ago, allowing the president under some circumstances to take actions following the declaration of an international emergency. What is an international emergency? The IEEPA statute, 50 U.S.C. section 1701, says that the emergency that a president must declare is any unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States, the threat being to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States if the president declares a national emergency with respect to such threat.
But does a threat like that actually exist? Well, the first resolution asked that question specifically in relation to Brazil. So here's Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia again with the backstory on why the tariffs are being applied to products from Brazil. And I fact-checked this. I'm calling it true.
President Trump is unhappy that Brazil is prosecuting a friend of his. The former president of Brazil, on his way out the door, inspired a lot of people to try to protest and even overturn the peaceful transfer of power when he lost an election. And so Brazil is prosecuting him under Brazilian laws. When the president heard that former President Bolsonaro was being prosecuted, he threatened 50% tariffs if you don't stop the Bolsonaro witch hunt trial. How is that trial an emergency for the United States? How is that trial a threat to American national security or our economy? I would assert, Mr. President, if we allow President Trump to declare this prosecution an emergency, we will have given any president a completely blank check to invent an emergency and do whatever they want and bypass Congress for doing so. This is not an emergency, and that's why I have filed with other senators a resolution to terminate President Trump's emergency.
And economically,
we have a trade surplus with Brazil of nearly $7 billion in goods and nearly $23 billion in services annually. Last year, the trade surplus we had with Brazil was $30 billion. They buy $30 billion more of our stuff than we buy of their stuff.
and so there doesn't seem to be any real emergency. You can't even spin that there's an economic one. It appears that Donald Trump is trying to protect another president who tried a scheme very similar to his own in order to remain president despite losing an election. But in Brazil, unlike here, that president is actually being held accountable. And so Rand Paul of Kentucky, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, Tom Tillis of one of the Carolinas, and Mitch McConnell of Kentucky voted with the Democrats to stop Trump's Brazil tariffs by killing his national emergency. And Rand Paul was the only Republican senator to speak during the debate. And as you heard and as he voted, he was against the tariffs. And so no one dared to verbally defend Trump's Brazil tariffs. Then the next day, the Senate voted on a similar resolution to kill Trump's national emergency that is allowing him to put tariffs on Canadian products, which Trump said he put in place for national security reasons. It's another abuse of his emergency powers. And the same group of Republicans, minus Tom Tillis, voted to kill this abuse of emergency powers too. Rand Paul of Kentucky, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, and Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. They voted with all the Democrats and independents. And this anti-Trump tariff resolution also passed. And then the next day, they did it again. And this was the biggest of them all, because this would have killed the fake emergency being used to enact tariffs on the whole world. And you won't be surprised to hear these Republicans voted with the Democrats and independents. Rand Paul of Kentucky, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, and Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. And the Mitch McConnell votes are notable and encouraging because he was the Senate Majority Leader for the Republicans for many years. And John Thune, the current Senate Majority Leader, he allowed these resolutions to get votes. These are signals from leadership. And it means that both of the recent leaders of the Senate Republicans have signaled that bowing to Trump 100% of the time is no longer required. Also, the timing of these votes, timed by Republican John Thune, is notable as well. These votes happened the week before the Supreme Court heard arguments from the Trump administration about the president's tariffs and his emergency declarations. And even though Trump has the veto pen, and these resolutions will not become law, the point was that half of Congress, the only half that was working, sent a very public message. And it boiled down to this. Here's Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota.
My colleagues and I have filed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. That case is going to be heard next week, but it's not the only answer. The answer should be that Congress asserts its power, even though I believe that the use of this statute is clearly illegal. And I believe that the underlying court, which was made up of the initial trade court, a Trump judge, an Obama judge, and a Reagan judge, yes, they still exist, they unanimously, the three of them, said that this was an illegal use of this statute.
And this was Congress, for one of the first times in this Congress, asserting its power. And in a way, telling the court that Congress considers Trump's actions illegal. Because the Supreme Court justices, they live in the world, and their job is to interpret statutes to determine Congress's intent. And so the way I see these votes is they seem to be a way for Congress to speak its intent. John Thune, leader of the Republicans, chose to spread these votes out over 3 days. Mitch McConnell voted for all of them. And so even though Thune didn't vote for them, because that would really piss off Daddy Trump, he allowed the message to be sent. And then I listened to some of the Supreme Court arguments and the comments made by the justices, even the Trump-appointed justices, and they didn't sound good for the administration. And did these votes have anything to do with that? I don't know. But the Supreme Court was probably aware that they happened. And now they are working on their decision behind closed doors. And we'll just have to wait and see what they say, because right now, the only way that the tariffs are going to stop is through the Supreme Court, because Trump is holding the veto pen. And these resolutions are not going to stop the tariffs, because even though they passed, they didn't pass by enough to override a Trump veto. And of course, Speaker Mike Johnson, whose lips are like a barnacle on Trump's ass. With Mike Johnson as the Speaker of the House, there's a snowball's chance in hell that he's going to allow these resolutions to even get a vote in the House. In fact, he's already made sure preemptively that they won't. Here's Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia during the debate on the third resolution, the one that would stop the global tariffs.
I hope this passes as the two previous resolutions did. And if it does, it will be up to the House to take this up. The House has done something that should really shock people in the public and in this body. This matter is privileged in the House as it is in the Senate. If it passes, House statutes and rules suggest that it should be taken up for a vote on the floor of the House. The rule in the House was that it would need to be within the committee for 15 days and then be reported, and then pending for 3 days on the floor. Action would be taken on these matters within 18 days in the House. Guess what? The House is so afraid to vote on tariffs. They are so afraid of the effects these tariffs are having on their constituents, but equally afraid of crossing Donald Trump, that they passed a rule that said for purposes of this and this only, the day today extends through the remainder of Congress. So the 15 days plus 3 days, it ripens in 18 days. Action must be taken in 18 days. They have defined today as a day that lasts to the end of Congress, so the matter will never ripen and be privileged in the House.
They redefined what a day is. And so Mike Johnson is clearly still successfully protecting President Trump's abuse of power. And as for his fellow barnacles in the Senate, how did they justify their votes to forfeit their taxation power to our Orange King? Well, most of them didn't bother to defend the tariffs or their own votes. Only one Republican bothered to participate in the debates on the president's side. And he only participated in 2 of the debates, and he read the same exact weak-ass speech both times. And here's the heart of his argument. Here's Senator Mike Crapo of Idaho.
SJ Res 88 is counterproductive to the progress already made by the president and the new gains he can still achieve in the ongoing trade negotiations.
In his speech, there was no response to the separation of powers arguments, or the taxation clause in the Constitution, or the emergency powers abuse. It was just the ends, we think, justify the means. Ugh. The shamelessness of most of the Republicans, their dereliction of duty in fealty to Donald Trump, it's just so pathetic. But I am holding on to the fact that Majority Leader Thune allowed these votes. He didn't use any dirty tricks to stop him. And the resolutions passed. And so there is some good news here. The barnacles are starting to get slippery. And then finally, the last thing worth knowing about in October is that the Senate passed their version of the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, the NDAA is passed every single year. It's what authorizes our wars. They have finished this on time every year for like 6 decades. And so it passed the Senate 77-20. And at this point, we're jumping back into real time here. I'm now speaking to you from mid-November. There are 6 weeks left in the year to negotiate with the House, or for the House to just pass the version that just passed the Senate. And so this is still a work in progress. And under normal circumstances, I like to read the NDAA because it's an interesting window into what actions are being approved of by both parties in matters of war, because it's literally the war authorization. But this year, I'm not sure reading it is even worth my time, because we have a president who is pretty clearly not at all worried about what the law says he can and cannot do. In matters of war, nothing is making that clearer than his actions at sea. Because as of this recording in mid-November, since mid-September, so just in the last 2 months, President Trump has ordered the bombing of 21 small boats, and he has killed at least 80 people. The Trump administration says that these people are being killed because they're smuggling drugs, and they are legally justifying the strikes by labeling these men narco-terrorists, with terrorist being the magic word needed to authorize the murder of foreigners thanks to the laws put on the books during the W. Bush years. Now, I'm recording this episode from Paris, France. I've been in Europe for 3 weeks now. I spent 2 weeks in Spain, a week in France, and 2 days in London. And in all 3 countries, I've watched the news. And in all 3 countries, the analysis has been that these strikes are likely illegal and the deaths described as likely murders. And some of our closest allies, such as the UK and Colombia, are now refusing to give the Trump administration any more intelligence information about suspected drug-running boats in order to avoid being complicit in these crimes. And as far as legality in the United States is concerned, Congress has authorized none of this. But the Senate did debate and vote on the issue in October because our branch of government is supposed to authorize all of our wars. And so specifically, they debated and voted on a resolution, which, if it became law, would block President Trump's ability to use the military to bomb boats in the Caribbean and other international waters, because his bombings have now spread to the Pacific Ocean too. The resolution was introduced by Republican Rand Paul, who has been a consistent critic of lawless murder by the president, regardless of who the president is and what party he represents. And here's the part of his long and passionate speech on the Senate floor, explaining his reasoning behind attempting to stop the violence being committed by this particular president.
Somewhere off the coast of Venezuela, a speedboat with 11 people on board is blown to smithereens. Vice President Vance announces that killing cartel members that poison our fellow citizens is the highest and best use of our military. When challenged that killing citizens without due process is a war crime, the Vice President's response is that he doesn't give a shit. Sometimes, in fits of anger, loud voices will say they don't care about the niceties such as due process. They just want to kill bad guys. For a brief moment, all of us share that anger and may even embrace revenge or retribution. But over 20,000 people are murdered each year in the U.S., and somehow we find a way to a dispassionate dispensation of justice that includes legal representation and a trial. Why? Because sometimes the accused is actually not guilty. Even with the best of care, even with the best of justice, sometimes we find out it's the wrong person. As passions subside, a civilized people should ask questions. To be clear, the people bombed to smithereens were guilty, right? If anyone gave a you-know-what about justice, perhaps those in charge of deciding whom to kill might let us know their names, present proof of their guilt, show evidence of their crimes. The administration has maintained that the people that they blew to smithereens were members of a gang, members of Tren de Aragua, and therefore narco-terrorists. Why? Because we say so. But certainly then, if they know that they belong to a particular gang, then someone must surely know their names before they were blown to smithereens. Is it too much to ask to know the names of those we kill before we kill them? To know what evidence exists of their guilt? At the very least, the government should explain how the gang came to be labeled as terrorists. How did the people who you say are in a gang, how did they come to be labeled as a terrorist? U.S. law defines a terrorist as someone who uses premeditated, politically motivated violence against non-combatants. Show us evidence of that. Show us evidence of their guilt. Show us evidence that they're a terrorist, perhaps before we blow people to smithereens. Which of course raises the question, who labeled them as terrorists, and what is the evidence of these specific people who had names before they were blown to smithereens? What is the evidence against them individually? What are their names? What specifically shows their membership and guilt? Were they armed at the time they were blown to smithereens? The blow them to smithereens crowd also conveniently ignores the fact that death is generally not the penalty for drug smuggling. If the Trump administration wants to use military power, they should seek authorization from Congress. There is a difference between war and peace. There is a difference in the rules of engagement. There has to be. Our police don't shoot people on sight. We have a process. Even off of the coast, we have a process. We have long-standing maritime law that we obey, as well as every other civilized nation in the world obeys. We board ships after announcing who we are and that we are going to board the ship. There is an escalation if there are weapons fired, if there is a reason where the Coast Guard can escalate. But we don't just blow ships to smithereens. The vote before us today offers every member of this body an opportunity to reverse the decades-long abdication of this critical responsibility of leaving this to the executive branch. Our founding fathers said, Congress shall authorize war. The executive is not authorized to do this. I encourage my colleagues to support this resolution.
But most of the Republicans did not support the resolution. And here's why. Here's Senator James Risch of Idaho.
Now, my colleague just referred to the fact that the president can, if there's an imminent attack on our country, that they can strike. This wasn't an imminent attack. This was an actual attack. It was in progress. It was going on. People were attacking our country by bringing in poisonous substances to deposit into our country that would have killed Americans all over America, including your constituents.
The Associated Press traveled to Venezuela to find out who some of these murdered men were. In their investigation, they identified a handful of the men murdered in the first few bombings. They were residents of one of the poorest towns in Venezuela. One of them was a fisherman. One was an out-of-work bus driver who couldn't afford to fix his bus when it broke down. Two were low-level criminals. They were expecting about $500 for helping traffickers sail through tricky waters off of their coast on a known route used to get cocaine from Colombia to Europe. The drugs probably weren't even coming here. And so were these men criminals? Probably. And they should have been arrested and tried in court because none of their offenses is even eligible for the death penalty. And so the idea that these men attacked the United States is absurd. But not to be outdone ever as the head cheerleader for violence, Senator Tom Cotton, of course a Republican, also defended the Trump administration and foreshadowed what might be to come.
The president's strikes were lawfully sound and extremely limited. Because they've been going on for less than 60 days, they don't even fall within the War Powers Resolution threshold. I would also note that presidential action like this is hardly unheard of or unique. For context, as of the mid-20th century, scholars identified more than 100 military deployments or actions that lack express prior congressional authorization. I could go back to the beginning of the Republic with the Barbary pirates off the coast of North Africa. But there's another example, much closer in time, and, for that matter, on the border. That would be President George H.W. Bush's decision to invade and topple the government of Panama in 1989 without prior congressional approval. He ordered 12,000 American troops into that country. We toppled Panama's illegitimate regime, we apprehended the country's dictator, and he spent the rest of his life in foreign custody. Now, let's compare these two cases. In both cases, you had the leader of a country that is indicted by the United States courts for drug trafficking. In both cases, that leader is not recognized by the United States government as the legitimate leader of his country. I'd say the comparison ends there because the case is much stronger here than it was in 1989. Maduro also has, I think, a $50 million reward on his head from our government. Maduro is associated with a designated foreign terrorist organization. Noriega didn't have a reward. Noriega wasn't associated with a designated foreign terrorist organization. Maduro is in league with China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. Noriega was not. Yet, George Bush invaded Panama and overthrew its government. I don't hear many Democrats in retrospect saying that this was an unwise action or made our country less safe. And somehow Donald Trump is doing those things merely by striking a few boats of drug traffickers in international waters.
Oh, the precedent of the lawless Bush family still haunts us as we continue to slide down the slipperiest of slopes. And he's right that President Bush set the precedent in overthrowing over governments without Congress and getting away with it. Doesn't make it legal, but they did it. But what I want you to notice is that Senator Cotton didn't focus his remarks on the fisherman or the bus driver or the 78 other men that Trump has killed at sea in the last 2 months. His focus was President Maduro, the president of Venezuela who Donald Trump tried to overthrow in a dum-dum coup the first time Trump was president. And I do want to say that the claims that Senator Cotton made about Maduro, some of those are highly questionable. But when it comes to Maduro, the Republicans have wanted this guy regime changed for a long time. And I told the whole story on this podcast back in the first Trump administration when they tried to overthrow him the first time. And we put those episodes, they're called Target Venezuela and A Coup for Capitalism. Those are in the show notes for you if you need a refresher. And even if you don't have time to listen to those, check out the show notes, which have dozens of articles for you to read and share. But right now, our military has an enormous amount of resources sitting off the coast of Venezuela. There are at least a dozen warships, 15,000 troops, and our military's largest aircraft carrier, and more. President Trump has publicly authorized the CIA to do whatever spook they do inside of Venezuela. And the president is openly discussing the fact that he's considering a land attack on Venezuela and the removal of Venezuela's president. And the woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize, a prize that has really become a joke, is waiting in the wings, literally in hiding, ready to take over Venezuela if President Trump frees the presidency for her. Democracy is not even in the conversation. The threats against Venezuela do not appear to be Trump word vomit like his threats against Greenland and Panama so far appear to be. The stage right now looks like it's being set for a real war, and our Congress is letting it happen. And on this issue, the wall of protection around President Trump in the Senate by the Republicans is still very much intact. The vote on Rand Paul's resolution to rein in the war powers of our increasingly lawless commander-in-chief failed, 48-51, with all Democrats and independents, plus Rand Paul of Kentucky and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, voting to stop President Trump's at-sea murder spree. But every other Republican and Democrat John Fetterman of Pennsylvania decided to allow President Trump to continue the slaughter. And I will fast forward here and let you know that they voted on a similar resolution as the bombings continued in November. And on November 6th, there was a similar result. It failed too, 49-51. Once again, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska were the only Republicans to vote to stop the murders. And this time, John Fetterman decided to vote like a Democrat with his fellow Democrats and independents to stop the murders. But the rest of the Republicans continue to be complicit in Donald Trump's lawlessness and abdicating their own power in the process. And so that was October. A House shamefully refusing to work. A Senate using shameful new procedural processes to get corrupt individuals into positions of power. A Senate refusing to stop illegal murders. But we also saw the first crack in the Trump protective wall appearing with 3 successful votes aimed at stopping Trump's illegal taxes. And that's not all they did. If you want all the details of congressional actions, including on bills in progress, so that you can take action before things become law, please pay for the show on Patreon, which gets you access to the Last Week in Congress series. But if you can't, I'll give you a summary of whatever shamelessness Congress exhibits in November. And thanks for listening. Before I wrap this up for the day, I do want to thank one of our new executive producers, although it's weird to call Mike new because he's not new at all. He has executive produced quite a few episodes. And if you're not in the know, for people that are producing this show, people paying for the show, every time you pay $535, you become an executive producer and you can put a credit on an episode of your choice. And that credit lends your vouch to the episode and moves it up our most valuable episodes list. And he could not have picked a better episode for this week because he put an executive producer credit and moved A Coup for Capitalism up the list. That is one of the episodes about the Trump attempted regime change in Venezuela from his first term. Mike also sent in a message that he wanted me to read to you guys. He said, I hope all is well with you and your families. I would like an executive producer credit for Congressional Dish 190, A Coup for Capitalism. I do not understand how the blowing up of boats in international waters is not immediate grounds for impeachment. Me too, bro. The use of the 9/11 authorization for the use of military force to drone anyone loosely called a terrorist doesn't cover it, and Trump openly says he does not need to consult with Congress. He can, quote, just kill them like dead, unquote. An admission if there ever was one. This episode adds to the info from Congressional Dish 176 and explains the attempt to call Juan Guaido the leader of Venezuela, and now they are positioning the recent recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize to fill that role. It's insane. Thank you for all that you do, and thank you for your part in We're Not Wrong. Your voice is desperately needed often to balance some of the takes of your co-hosts. Well, thank you, Mike. Yeah, I appreciate your support for this show, and thank you for putting executive producer credit on those episodes, because I want them moved up the list, because I can't. Well, I was just about to say I can't believe they're doing this again, but I absolutely can believe that they're doing this again. Marco Rubio has wanted to regime change Venezuela for quite a while now. If he pulls this off, watch out, Cuba. But the fact that he's been empowered as our Secretary of State, this was, if you know anything about Marco Rubio, this is exactly where you could see that appointment going. So yeah, thank you, Mike. And thank you to all of our producers and executive producers. And thank you for listening to this show. Thank you also to Claire, who's my production and research assistant. She did the first run of looking at all 100 something of those confirmations. So she did a lot of work on this one, and it's tedious work. So thank you, Claire. Thank you, Mike at Pro Podcast Solutions, for editing this episode. Thank you, Mark at podcastbranding.co, for doing our web design and security. Thank you, Lauren, for keeping track of our executive producers. Thank you, Dad, for doing my taxes. And thank you, Brian Karras, our forever guardian angel. And of course, thank you to you for continuing to pay attention to Congress when I can testify. It's really hard to do so right now. And so I appreciate your engagement. Without you, I would also be considering just not paying any attention, but I don't think that's good for the country. So thank you so much. I will be back soon, as fast as I can, with an episode about the law that reopened the government. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. What the facts? And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.